Where the Rivers Meet, Chapter 1. The railroad trestle lay across the canyon like a web strung between two enormous rocks. Far below the wooden beam of the trestle, the gorge was choked with water boiling between the steep sides. A constant low roar climbed up the canyon walls. Jagged snow-tipped peaks rose on either side of the river like rows of gigantic wolves' teeth. Nancy Atone stood silently in the middle of the trestle. Her feet were planted on two ties, and between them she could see the Tangle River 1,000 feet below her. She rocked towards the edge, catching her balance just before she swayed an inch too far and arched like a diving eagle to the rocks below. She liked the rush of excitement as she swayed forward until she could see the water beyond the dark brown edge of the railroad ties. She studied the water as it boiled through the gorge. It moved with urgency, pulsing and rushing like the blood in her own veins. No matter where she went, even when she had been in Kamloops or Vancouver, she could always hear the roar resonating dully in her ears. She could feel the bridge shudder as the river crashed and swirled around the rocks on its way, slowly, patiently, blunting their sharpness. She had always known the river. She lived in a small bench of land that had been leveled by the river thousands of years before, as it ate its way more deeply into the rocks. But her feelings for it was more than familiarity. Her memory of the river seemed old, ancient. It was a mute memory, an immensely ancient knowledge of the soul of the river. Though Nancy stood just above a single river, just 1.5 miles east, the water split into two rivers. The two were separated by Tushwa, Arrowhead Mountain, and they seemed to sneak up on each other until they rounded the point of the mountain and swirled together, boiling and foaming as they collided. But they didn't mix, at least not immediately. On one side, the clear blue-green water from the north fought off the brown, muddy fingers of the larger river from the east. The whites had their own names for the river, but Nancy knew them by the names of her grandmother. The northern river was Kawalatkwa, Green River, and the broader river was known as Kawalakwikut, the river that isn't clear. And this place, too, had its own name, not Craigton, as the townspeople called it, but Huapetqua, where the waters meet. Nancy turned her head and looked westward, watching as the two rivers continued their struggle in the canyon below. Gradually, the murky waters of the Huapetqua absorbed the Kawalatkwa until at the bend about 5 miles downstream, the rivers disappeared from sight into a wall of craggy peaks, and there was only a thin emerald line against the northern shore. Just like our people, the Shuswap, she thought, reduced to a sliver of what they had once been. And she began to rock again, a tiny figure suspended high above the river, swaying like a leaf in the wind. Above the low thunder of the river, a horn honked impatiently. She looked up to see George's battered pickup parked on the road above the tracks on the southern side of the bridge. Even from the middle of the trestle, she could see the irregular circles of brown paint surrounding holes rusted through the fenders and doors. The brown splotches against what was left of the green paint gave the truck the look of a well-used World War II surplus vehicle, complete with camouflage. As she watched, George waved and shouted something that was drowned out by the roar of the water. She raised her hand in acknowledgement and started towards the truck. Nancy barely glanced at the ties as she walked slowly across the trestle. Her feet were sure. She had walked the treacherous bridge with its terrifying gaps between the ties many times before. Vaguely she hoped a train wouldn't come. She thought about the first time in the past when she had gotten trapped on the bridge. The first time it had happened when she was only 6. She could remember her father's shouts as the train careened out of the trees and thundered into the bridge. She had quickly lain on the far edge of the ties as her father had ordered. 1,000-foot drops on one side, the screaming wheels and shrieking whistle of the train 6 inches away on the other. A wave of terror swept through her as she remembered the train rushing by her, the trestle jumping and shaking as like a wild horse intended to throw her into the chasm only inches away. She pressed her face into the ties, aware only of the sharp smell of tar, all sound blocked by the screaming of the wheels as they swept by. She had tried to wrap her legs around the ties to brace against the shaking and dug her fingers into the ties until she could feel her skin tearing against the hard wood. Nancy shook her head to try and clear the old memory. That had been the worst time. Later, she had gotten less and less scared, but still she dreaded the sight of the big orange snout with its single eye hurling towards her. Even now she felt her stomach turn soft as she thought about the bridge shuddering and quivering as the train rolled onto the trestle, its horn blasting a useless warning. With no time to turn back and a sheer drop into the gorge below, there was only the 3 feet of bare tie for refuge. As she walked, she thought about her aunt who had died on the bridge 2 years ago. The engineer said she'd just stood on the side as the train approached. She must have lost her balance, he'd told the police. Wasn't my fault. What could I do? And the railway certainly wasn't to blame. After the band had written them about the situation, they received a curt reply. Our hands are tied, they wrote. We have posted signs at each end warning people not to go out on the trestle. If they choose to disregard the warnings, we are not responsible for the consequences. The band's suggestion that a simple walkway and handrail be installed was flatly rejected. The expense would run into several $1,000s, the letter read, and we are under no obligation whatsoever to provide such a facility. After all, she thought angrily, only Indians lived over there anyways. So no one was responsible and no one was at fault. And yet 7 people had died on the bridge over the last few years because the only other way across the river was by a ramshackle ferry that ran 3 miles upstream and closed at 8 in the evening. Nancy felt her bitterness turned into something else, something duller, as she walked the last few feet to the southern side of the canyon. It was anger and rage mixed with helplessness, bewilderment, and shame, and it filled her up until she almost choked. Still seething inside, Nancy climbed up the sandy bank towards the waiting truck. Finally, she reached the edge of the broad bench that contained the town and stood on the road. "For God's sake," George called from the side of the truck, "are you in some sort of trance, lady? I thought you were going to camp out there. You're going to be late for school, and I was supposed to be at the mill half hour ago." Nancy shifted from the jumble of houses and buildings to George's face, his eyes rolling in exasperation. He was the handsomest man she had ever seen. His deep brown eyes were almost as black as his pupils, giving his clear chestnut skin an even darker cast. His long black hair was pulled back in the usual ponytail and tied near his head with a strip of red cloth. As always, a smile played around his lips. She didn't think she'd ever seen George without a smile. It seemed to dance around his face like a warm flame, lighting up his eyes with a dark glow. Even her silence couldn't put a damper on that flame as she climbed into the truck. "Uh-oh," George muttered teasingly. "Looks like you're in one of your moods. Don't I even get a kiss? No? Well, I guess making out is out of the question then." She stared steadily at the floor while he snorted and chuckled. "You're such a wit," she commented acidly. "Why don't you ever clean this thing?" She gestured at the inside of the truck, littered with candy bar wrappers, beer bottles, chocolate, milk cartons, and at least a dozen Big Mac containers. "Geez, it looks like you've been out stealing trash from McDonald's." "Nah," George replied. "It's just that the McDonald's stuff is plastic, so it doesn't break down as quickly. See? Most of the stuff I throw in here gets composted and turned into topsoil. That's when this old truck has the big one, and it's spirit heads for that big junkyard in the sky. I can park it out front of the house and plant turnips in it." Nancy carefully lifted a few layers of trash with her toe on her shoe. Sure enough, tiny green shoots were pushing their way through the debris. "I think it's disgusting," she said. "You're not just into organic gardening, babe. Why, I think I'll try starting individual pumpkin plants in those Big Mac boxes. This could become a regular rolling greenhouse." Obviously delighted with the idea, George grinned broadly. Nancy looked out the window as the truck ground into gear and pulled off the sandy shoulder. The old pickup shook and rattled, and the eagle feather tied to the rearview mirror shuddered in sympathy. She slid towards the door, trying to avoid the springs that clawed up through the gaping tears in the vinyl upholstery. At some point the rip had been half-heartedly covered with grey duct tape, but the tape had been no match for the spring and had been quickly thrust aside. It now spread itself across the seat like flying paper just waiting to latch onto unweary posteriors. George reached over to turn on the radio. As he fumbled with a bare stem where the knob should have been, his hand hit a stick that wedged the radio into the hole in the dash. The whole works fell onto the floor, trailing wires and entrails. Nancy shook her head as George tried to replace the radio, turn it on, and drive through town simultaneously. "George Thomas, would you look where you're going?" Nancy shrieked as the truck lurched straight towards Gerb's store window. George looked up, yanked the wheel to the left, and waved cheerfully to a group of tourists who had flattened themselves in terror against the store. "Did you see them?" George chortled as the truck roared down the street. "Man, they thought some crazy Indian had traded his pony in for a truck and was after their scalps. Maybe I should go back and have another run at them. What do you say? Maybe they'll circle up the greyhounds." "George, sometimes I think you're out of your mind," Nancy said fiercely. "You almost put your truck into Greb's display window, taking 4 innocent bystanders with you, not to mention me. And you think it's all a big joke. Are you going to drive me to school, or should I get out and walk?" George smiled merrily. "School? Oh yeah, I knew we were headed somewhere." He jammed his foot down on the accelerator, and the old truck, shrieking in dismay, leapt forward like a stung mare. They flew up from the town on the steep road that wound its way up to the high school. She could see it now, hanging over the steep canyon like an enormous buzzard perched on the ledge. Nancy had never been able to figure out exactly why the school had been located 2 miles out of town and on the main highway. She had been told once that it was to take advantage of the view. But if that had been the concern, why had the place been built with virtually no windows? Perhaps it had more to do with being close to the heights, the white enclave located just above the highway and as far from the reserve as possible. As they neared the school, the fortress effect became more pronounced. The few narrow windows looked more like gun portals, and the unrelieving grey cinder-block construction gave the structure an air of somberness and gloom. Nancy hated the school. Not in the same dull, aching way she hated the town, but with a bright, active hatred that flared up like a flame every time she got near the place. No matter how much she distasted, she was going to get through. It was her ticket out. As the truck came to a stop by the drive leading to the school, Nancy put her hand where the inside door handle should have been, forgetting that it had been gone for years. George laughed and opened his door, holding it open for her, and bowed gallantly. She slid over and climbed out. "I've got to fix that thing one day," he muttered. Standing beside him, she paused, hooked her arms around his solid waist, and raised herself up to kiss him. "George," she said quietly, "when are we going to get out of here? I just want to leave this place." His smile lost some of its warmth, and his eyes grew hard. He stood staring at the wedge of open sky between the steep sides of the canyon. From here they could see about 6 miles up the canyon to the west before the mountains closed ranks. Behind them, the 2 rivers thrust into the north and east, quickly disappearing into the ranges that flanked them. All around them, the mountains seemed to form a solid, impenetrable wall. George pointed west to the points where the river bent out of sight, and the peaks seemed to join like clasped fingers. His fingers traced the ragged boundaries of the canyon eastward, then continued its jagged eclipse around the northern perimeter until it was pointed west again. He lowered his arms. "This is the world," he spoke slowly, barely moving his lips. "It begins there and it ends there." He seemed to shake himself, and some of the lightness came back into his face. "This is my world," he laughed. "There's nothing else out there. What kind of nonsense are they feeding you in that place anyways?" She looked at him silently for a moment. "I mean it, George. We've got to get out. This town's a killer, and you know it." "Well, right now I'm worried about my boss," George smiled, getting back to his truck and slamming the door twice to get it to catch. "I know he's a killer, and I'm already an hour late for work. See you tonight." The truck squealed off the spray of gravel and dust. At the highway, George stopped at the stop sign and opened the door. He stood on the rusty running board and blew her a kiss before wheeling around the turn and heading for the mill. Nancy waved, turned towards the school. End of chapter 1.